We are conducting this here at OPM's headquarters in Washington, D.C. in our auditorium. We do have a few people here today, but the majority of our audience is watching us via webcast, and so I just wanted to welcome all of them. But I also wanted to mention that the slides that we're going to be speaking to today are attached to the OMB Max webpage where everyone was to register for this session. So you can go back to that webpage, scroll down to the bottom, and you'll see a little link for the attachments if you need to access those. And at the very top of that page, you can find the email address where you can submit your questions to us today. Okay. My name is Tara Ricci. I am going to be presenting this session along with my colleague, Julie Osowski. We are personnel research psychologists here at OPM. We work in the Standards, Competencies, and Assessment Development Group. We collaborated on a structured interview guide. That guide forms really the basis for the training that we're doing today, but it's also available on our website, so I encourage you to go to our website and download a copy if you'd like. One of the very last slides of our presentation has the web address that you can go to get those slides. Okay. Get this. Okay. There we go. I'm going to quickly go over what we're going to cover today in today's session. We have 5 sections. We're going to talk first, just give an introduction to what structured interviews are, what makes them structured. Talk about how to develop the structured interview questions themselves. We have 2 different types of interview questions that we'll talk about. Then we'll talk about how to actually conduct structured interviews using a panel of trained raters. Of course, following that, we'll talk about how to evaluate candidates who complete the structured interview using a standardized rating scale and rating process. And then also just some general tips and techniques for conducting interviews that are helpful to share with anybody who's going to be a part of the interview process. So what is a structured interview? It's basically it's an assessment method. If you attended our first session, I talked about a lot of different types of assessment methods that are used, and this is one of them. It can be used as a part of the rating and ranking process. But structured interviews are also used just by the selecting official. The main difference is that if it's being used by the selecting official, it doesn't necessarily have to be scored. It can be scored, but that's really the main difference. If it's being used as a part of the assessment process, a part of the rating and ranking, then there will need to be a scoring process that's a part of the interview itself. The reason it's structured is because it does use a very standard question and scoring process, and I'm going to talk about what really makes up this standard structured process that we talk about. So those of you who are here today, how many of you have experience using structured interviews? Okay, we have a few people. That's great. I think that they're being used more and more in the federal government. We're certainly using them a lot in our office, and it's really working out well. I really think that the people that go through the process think it's very fair and makes sense to them. So I'm glad to see that so many of you are wanting to participate today and learn more about it. So some of the key standardized features, there we go. All the questions are developed by subject matter experts, and these questions are targeted to competencies that have been shown to be required for the job. So it's meeting those important key features that you need in any assessment method that it's based on a job analysis. Now, all the candidates are given the same opportunity to provide information about themselves because they're being asked the same questions in the same order. Everybody's exposed to the same assessment process. We have a panel of trained interviewers that are taking detailed notes on the responses. This provides critical documentation for the scoring process. The responses are evaluated using a standard process, and the interviewers agree on what acceptable answers are. So basically, everybody's being held to the same standard, which ensures a fair process. This is very different than unstructured interviews where the questions can vary based on, who comes in the door. But the real purpose of a structured interview is that you've defined the competencies that you want to assess, and you go through a very standard process for everybody who's involved. So why is structure and standardization important? There are several key features that you want to look for when you're evaluating an assessment method. And these are some of the things that we talked about during our first assessment training session. The first thing, of course, is validity. Does the assessment method measure what it's intended to measure? Structured interviews actually have pretty good validity compared to other assessment methods. They're really one of the best. So you really, because you're focusing on job requirements and the questions are being designed by subject matter experts, if you're following all the steps in developing a good structured interview process, they really do have good validity. So you have that, but in addition, they're very reliable. The content, the rating scales, they're standardized across all the candidates, so everybody's being assessed in a consistent way. So if you remember, reliability is an important piece of getting at validity. So you have the reliability as well. It's fair. Candidates are given the same opportunities to provide information, and they're objectively evaluated on the same scale. So again, it's definitely perceived as fair by people who go through the process. And it's practical because you are focusing on the few key competencies that are important for the job. So you're really focusing in, you're taking advantage of this opportunity to really gather as much information as you can from the candidate on the competencies that you're targeting for assessment. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of what structured interviews are. They are a really great assessment method to use, but now we need to kind of talk about, well, now if I want to use a structured interview, how do I go about doing that? We actually have about 8 key steps that go into developing structured interview questions and a structured interview process. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, and again, I would refer you to our structured interview guide for more information. The first thing, and this is the first step in designing any assessment method, is you need to have your job analysis. In many cases, you may already have a job analysis that's available. Of course, if it's not a current job analysis, we would definitely recommend that you have your subject matter experts review the information and confirm that the job tasks and the competencies haven't changed, and if they have changed, how have they changed? If you don't have that information, then you'll need to do the job analysis. And, of course, you can refer to the Delegated Examining Operations Handbook that gives you all the guidance you need on how to conduct a job analysis, including the forms that you can use. Okay. All right. So you've done the job analysis. Typically, you're going to have more competencies as a result of the job analysis than really is feasible to assess in the structured interview. So you're going to have to figure out, well, which competencies do we want to assess? First, you might want to consider what competencies are going to be assessed elsewhere in the selection process. So maybe you can exclude some right there that are already going to be assessed elsewhere. The other thing you might want to consider is that the structured interview is one of the things that it's really good for is assessing things that we call like soft skills or high-touch competencies, things that are more like interpersonal skill, teamwork, customer service, those types of competencies. They're ideal for those types of competencies. We do typically recommend that you assess between 4 and 6 competencies, much more than that, and you run the risk of the interview just being too long. We estimate it takes you want to give the candidates at least 5 minutes, and sometimes more, to respond to each interview question. So once you start adding that up, it can get to be kind of long, because you also have to think about you're going to have time up front where you're giving candidates an overview of the interview process, and then at the back end you're going to allow time for them to ask questions about the position and the organization and such. So it's really just kind of figuring out what's feasible. You don't want the interview to run too long, particularly if you're going to have a lot of candidates that you're going to be assessing. I can also suggest that you go to OPM's Assessment Decision Tool. It's on our website. This is, for those of you who didn't participate in our first session, we talked a little bit about that, but the ADT can basically help you, based on the competencies that you want to assess, help you identify what assessment method is best suited for those competencies. And it actually can work the other way, where if you know you want to do a structured interview, it can help you figure out, well, what's the structured interview? What competencies is it best for assessing? So I do recommend you look at that. I think I can't really see it so well. There. Okay. Now I'm just going to talk about some general tips on developing interview questions. The first thing that you want to think about is, of course, you've identified the competencies that are important for the job, the ones that you want to assess through the interview process. But in terms of just writing interview questions, there's certain things that you want to keep in mind. The first thing is that the questions are open-ended. The interview is really intended to gather information from the candidate, so you certainly want to write questions that are going to enable them to provide that information. So using open-ended questions is critical. Clear and concise questions. You don't want questions that are too lengthy. You want them to be fairly straightforward because you certainly don't want to have people interpreting them different ways. So it's always important to just be very clear and concise. Think about the reading level depending on the position that you're filling. If it's an entry-level job, you may need to think about the reading level of the questions. You don't want to use language that's a little bit more complex. Just really using simple language. So, for example, instead of saying something like, tell me about a time you affected a policy change, you can make it much simpler and just say, tell me about a time you changed policy. It's just simple things like that, using plain language. And the other thing we talk about is keeping things free of jargon, especially, in the federal government we have lots of acronyms, terminology that, the longer you're part of the federal government, the more this just becomes ingrained in your day-to-day work. But if you're doing an interview process where there may be people coming from outside, you just want to think about, have I used appropriate language for those people? Will they understand what we're talking about? And the other thing that we recommend is to consider using superlative adjectives in the questions themselves. And what this basically means is that instead of saying, tell me about a time, you say, tell me about the best time or the worst time. Tell me about the best project you ever worked on. Tell me about the most difficult team you ever had to lead. When you use those types of words, it can help the candidate kind of trigger in their mind, oh yeah, I know, I can tell you exactly about the hardest project I ever had to lead or the most difficult team I ever had to work on. So it just kind of helps the candidate in coming up with a good example that they can share with you. And that just helps them, and it helps you as the rater to get the best information out of them. I don't know about this. There we go. Okay. One of the things that we're going to kind of touch on throughout the session today is what we call the STAR model. And this is just the model that we use in developing both the interview questions themselves, but also the follow-up questions that are used, and even the rating materials. And the STAR model really lays out the 3 key elements that we look for in defining the interview questions and what we'd expect to hear back from the candidate and their response to those questions. So these questions should be designed to elicit the 3 important pieces of information. The first is the situation or the task, the context or the background of the situation. So it kind of sets the stage for the experience that they're about to share with you. The action, that's where you're actually getting at what the candidate did, what their role was, how they dealt with the situation. And then the result is, of course, the consequence. What was the outcome of that event? So we really look for that throughout this process. And it's something that we'll refer back to keep in mind throughout. Okay. There are 2 types of structured interview questions that we use and that we talk about in our structured interview guide. The first is behavioral, and these are questions that actually draw from a candidate's actual behavior during past experience. So these are questions that are actually asking the candidate to tell you about their experience or education or something that they did in their past that helps demonstrate the competency that you're trying to assess. And in this case, it's a very common premise in psychology that the past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. Now, for the situational question, this is a little bit different. It's no longer asking them to share about their experience or behavior in the past, but you're actually posing a dilemma to the candidate, a problem, a hypothetical situation, and they have to then respond on how they would handle that situation. So they're kind of getting at different things, but they're both very effective in assessing competencies. The one thing I would mention is that the situational questions might be better for people who are entry level, who don't have a lot of experience to draw on. So it might make more sense to use those for those entry level positions, where of course behavioral would be ideal for people who have experience for maybe a higher level position. Or you can use both. They're both useful. That you get good information out of both of them. Okay. So now we've talked about some of the guidelines for developing interview questions, the STAR model, about things being open-ended, clear and concise language. Now it's time to actually develop the questions themselves. And this is where you'll need to call on the assistance of subject matter experts. Typically you'll need to convene a panel of maybe 6 to 7. Get much more than that, it might get a little bit too difficult to manage that much input, but usually a panel of 6 to 7 is effective. You'll want to spend some time with the subject matter experts, we sometimes call them SMEs, just letting them get familiar with the materials, the competencies that are going to be assessed, the job tasks that are associated with those competencies. You'll want to, of course, talk about the STAR model and the other general tips for creating interview questions so that they have a good understanding of what the purpose is. If you're going to use just behavioral questions or if you're going to use situational, all of that needs to be kind of presented to the subject matter experts so that they can get an understanding of the purpose. But their role is because they know about the job, and they're going to be in the best position to craft these questions that are appropriate for the position. So it's just a little bit different for each one. In both cases, you're going to need subject matter expert, but the process is going to be a little bit different. For the behavioral questions, you're going to want to have them brainstorm some of experiences that they may have had themselves, and they can do this as a group. But they'll have the competencies. It would be ideal to give them a few sample questions that they can kind of refer back to as a model, and just let them spend some time as a group talking about and just brainstorming different ideas for what would be a good behaviorally based question for the particular competencies that you're focusing on. And it's always a good idea to have them generate more than you're actually going to need, because as you go through the review process and the pilot testing process, some of those questions are going to be discarded. So it's always a good idea to have more. And again, just have them refer back to the tips on developing good interview questions. I apologize. Every time I move this forward, it goes forward ahead 2. Okay. So here's an example for a behavioral question. And this is based on the competency of interpersonal skills. And this is just a good way to illustrate how the competency and the competency definition itself is really good material for the subject matter experts to use in crafting those questions. If you look at the definition, it covers a lot of different elements of interpersonal skill that those subject matter experts can then pull from to draft their questions. So in this case, the example question is, describe a situation in which you dealt with individuals who are difficult, hostile, or distressed. And you can see that comes straight from the definition. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the question itself, and this is what we call the lead question. We will also talk about follow-up questions, but this lead question covers all 3 elements of the STAR model. It's got the situation or task, dealing with individuals who are difficult, hostile, or distressed, who was involved. It gets at the action, what were the specific actions that you took, and then it has the results, and what were the results. So it has all 3 elements in there. Has anybody in the audience used behavioral questions before? Are there any examples anybody would like to share? We have microphones if anybody. No? Okay. Yes. Okay.
Which steps, if any, can be streamlined or eliminated for the selecting manager performing a structured interview, not a part of the assessment score?
So what parts can they streamline or, okay.
Which steps, if any, can be streamlined or eliminated?
Right. Well, for the structured interview that's just being used by the selecting official, they're certainly not going to be doing the scoring piece if they don't need to. So they can skip the process of having to give individual scores. With the selecting official, the rating and ranking has already been done. So these people have already been basically assessed and demonstrated that they're ready for the job. It's just a matter for the selecting official to figure out what information they need to make that final decision. So the questions, we still advise using the same questions for everybody, but you wouldn't necessarily have to go through the same process of working with subject matter experts to develop the rating scales, to do all of that piece of it. You could just decide what are the competencies I want to assess during the structured interview piece and just go from there. There doesn't necessarily have to be the rating and ranking. So from the 8 key steps, I would focus on determining the competencies and just developing the questions. It might still be a good idea to pilot test. That's one of the key steps out of the 8 steps that we're going to be talking about. So they might want to also do that piece as well. Okay. All right. Let's talk about situational, developing situational interview questions. Now this process is going to be a little bit different. You're actually going to need more subject matter experts to develop situational questions because you'll have 2 panels of subject matter experts. The first panel is going to follow what we call the critical incident method. And this is a common method that's used in assessment development because it provides good information that can be used to develop assessment questions, test questions. And basically, it has subject matter experts go through a process where they think about really effective or really ineffective events that have occurred typically in the workplace. And so they'll just spend some time really telling a story of what this critical incident is. So this first panel of subject matter experts, that's really all they're doing. They've been provided with the list of competencies that are going to be a part of the interview. And then what they're just going to do is think about these effective or ineffective events that have occurred in the workplace. And they'll write a story about it. And it pretty much follows the same STAR model. They'll talk about the situation or task, what the action was, whether it was effective or ineffective, and why, and then what the end result would be. And in the case of an ineffective critical incident, they'll talk about, why was it ineffective and what could have been done differently. And in our structured interview guide, we do have the forms that you can use for those subject matter experts to tell these stories. It has all the key elements laid out. So the first panel writes these critical incidents. It's then important to have another group kind of review and confirm what they've come up with. And so this second group is going to review these critical incidents, but they're not going to look at them in the context of the competencies. Actually, their job is to then assign the critical incidents to the competencies. And that's just kind of a confirmation step. So it's just a way to make sure that what this initial group thought measured interpersonal skills really does measure interpersonal skills. So they go through and they match them to competencies. The critical incidents that match to the appropriate competency are retained. The ones that aren't a good match are discarded. So again, you're going to want to have the SMEs develop more than you're going to need. And then once they've finished doing that process, the second group then actually writes the situational questions. And they're basically hypothetical situations. And those subject matter experts, they can work as a group because they really have the best knowledge of the job itself, and they can really craft what is a realistic dilemma or situation for the candidate to respond to. Okay. So here's an example. Again, working with the competency of interpersonal skills. So here's this scenario. A very angry client walks up to your desk. She says she was told her office sent her an overdue check 5 days ago. She hasn't received the check. She has bills to pay. No one is helping her. How would you handle the situation? Okay. So again, it's just a hypothetical situation. It's realistic of what might occur on the job, and it's tied to the specific competency that you're trying to assess. Okay. Okay. So that's the process of developing the questions, the lead questions themselves. But another key piece of the interview are the follow-up questions, what we call the probe questions, because it may be that candidates don't provide enough information based on that lead question, or you need to clarify information or try to get more specific information out of the candidate. So you'll want to decide when you're developing your structured interview if you want to have these follow-up questions, and if so, you'll need to come up with a set of these questions that can be used for each question in the interview. What I would say about the probe questions is, again, you're going to want to make sure that you're trying to get at all 3 elements of the STAR model: the situation, the action, and the result. But we also have just some general do's and don'ts for developing probe questions. You don't want to lead the candidate, so the goal of the probe is you want to get the information you need without necessarily leading them to a particular answer. You do want to get at their specific role or action. Sometimes when a candidate's responding to a structured interview question, they're talking about a project that they were a part of, a team that they were on, but not necessarily getting real specific about what their role was. And so the probe questions can be useful in kind of following up on that, getting at what their particular role was. You don't want to challenge them. You want these probe questions to be written in a very neutral way. So instead of saying something like, why didn't you try different approaches? Why didn't you try a different approach? You could just make it much more neutral and say, what different approaches did you try? And then, of course, in most cases, you want the probe questions to be open-ended because you're really trying to draw out some additional information from the candidate. So we just have some samples for following the STAR model for both the behavioral and the situational questions. So the probes for the behavioral questions are very much because the person is talking about their actual experience, they're very specific, factual, what was involved, what factors led up to that particular situation, what was your role, how did you respond. And you can actually, once you've developed your questions themselves, you can actually make these a little bit more specific to the question. These are fairly general. And then we have the situational probes. And because these are targeted towards a hypothetical situation, they're just going to be written to be more appropriate for that type of question. So does anyone in the audience have any example probes that they would like to share? Have you used probe questions in your structured interviews? No? Okay. All right. Okay, so you've developed your questions and your follow-up probe questions. So you've got all that laid out. The next key thing that we'll need to work on is deciding how you're going to evaluate candidates on the questions. So you'll need to come up with your rating scale and the associated material that goes along with that. So the first thing is to decide on the range for the proficiency level scale, for the rating scale. We usually use recommend using between 3 or 7 rating points. If you use fewer than 3, you're probably not going to get enough distinction among the candidates. But if you go much above 7, then sometimes the interviewers find it more difficult to make those fine distinctions. And in some cases, I've seen rating scales that are 9 levels, but then even within those 9 levels, they've been collapsed into sub-levels. So it just seems like between 3 and 7 seems to work the best for the interviewers. You'll want to label at least 3 of those levels. If you're going to be using more than 3, it just really, you want to kind of anchor the lowest, the mid, and the highest level of response. Now at OPM, we do use a 5-level proficiency level rating scale for competencies. It's level 1 is awareness. That's the lowest level. That's for somebody who can apply a competency in very simple situations, but they're going to need a lot of guidance. And the highest, level 5, is expert. And in that situation, that's somebody who can apply competencies in extremely difficult situations, and they're really seen as a key resource. People go to them for help in applying the competency. So that's the scale we use. Any examples from the audience? Do people use like a 3-level scale or 5 levels? Yes? 5 levels? Yeah. Yeah, that seems to work well for us. Okay. So once you've decided on your rating scale and the number of levels, you'll need to develop examples to kind of go along with that. The examples are very helpful for the raters, the ones who are conducting the interview and actually evaluating the candidates on the rating scale itself. And so in this part of the process, you're going to once again want to go to your subject matter experts and get them to kind of help you generate these examples, because the examples are drawn from the job itself. So if it's a position, say in engineering, you're going to have examples of what an expert level in that particular competency is in the engineering field. And so they're really the ones that can generate those types of examples that you can then link to the different levels in the rating scale. So and it's usually a good idea to use the same subject matter experts because they're already familiar with the process and what the goal is and what you're doing. So they'll individually kind of come up with these examples. They can discuss it as a group. It's important that they reach consensus so that everybody kind of has a common understanding. That indicates that it's a good example if everyone's kind of in agreement on, yes, this is an example of an intermediate level. Yes, this is an example of expert level. So get them to discuss it, come to consensus, and then you can just link those to the rating scale itself, and you put that into the rating form that will be used by the interviewers. Okay. And really, for the situational questions, it's very much the same. You'll want to have the subject matter experts come together, talk about what it means to really answer the situational question at the highest level. And they can kind of just spend some time detailing what would they really expect from somebody who answers this question at the highest level versus what would you expect of somebody who, didn't quite address all of the elements that are important to answering this situational question. And so they, again, can do that as a group, spend a little time working on drafting these hypothetical responses independently, discussing it as a group, and then coming to consensus on what are the best ones to use. And then again, you can just put that into your rating form. Okay. That's kind of the process for developing the interview itself. But it's not everything, because particularly if you're using an interview as a part of the assessment process, there's more that goes into it. You have to kind of figure out how the whole process itself is going to work. And so at first, one of the first things we recommend is that you pilot test it to make sure that the questions are working, but not only the questions, but the whole process itself, particularly if you're going to have quite a few interviews being conducted, maybe one after the other. You want to kind of work out the whole process and make sure everything's running smoothly and that everybody understands their role. So we definitely recommend doing some type of pilot test. But the other thing that you want to do is you'll want to develop an interviewer's guide. The interviewer's guide is really the resource that those interviewers will use throughout the process. It will have all the questions, the competencies that are being assessed. It will have rating forms that they will use at the end when they're making their ratings. It has the instructions that they'll use when they're talking to the candidates and telling, kind of walking them, this is what's going to happen here today as a part of this structured interview. It's got all of that laid out for them. So there will need to be some time spent just coming up with this interviewer's guide. And again, we do have checklists, lists that you can refer to, sample forms in our structured interview guide. Some of the other things that you'll need to think about is for a panel interview where it's being done as part of the rating and ranking process, you'll need to decide how many interviewers you're going to use. And if those are going to be, if you're going to have the same interviewers for each panel, or if you're going to let different people serve on different panels. If you're going to have a lot of applicants and you're going to be running a lot of people through structured interviews, it may not be feasible to have the same interviewers conducting each interview because they just won't have time. I mean, everybody has other responsibilities. But the important thing is that everybody gets trained. And that's what the remainder of our training session is going to be on, is the actual training of the interviewers. But you'll need to decide that how many interviewers and how they're going to be on each panel. But the other thing is the final rating process. Using a panel interview, each person's going to be making their independent rating, but then you have to decide, well, how are we going to do a final score for the candidate? You can average those ratings, or you can go through a consensus process where you require the people who served on the panel to discuss their individual ratings and then come to consensus. And, there are different ways you can set that up, different rules you can use. In some cases, if you're just having 2 interviewers, you may want to require that they come to perfect agreement, meaning that they both agree that the individual scored at a level 3 on the interview question. If you're having more than 2 people, sometimes it's okay to say, okay, everybody has to come within 1 point, and then you could just take the majority. So if you've got 3 panelists, 2 of them scored the person a 3 on the question, the other one scored a 2, that's considered consensus. But if you find that they're more of a range than that, typically we would recommend that you go through a consensus process where they have to discuss the scores that they gave and how they came up with them. And the reason that we do that is because the structured interview it's a live event, and the interviewers are documenting what's going on during that event, but they may have missed different things or they may have interpreted things differently. So when you use a consensus process, that gives them the opportunity to discuss as a group, share what they've come up with, and maybe clarify things amongst themselves to make sure that everybody was using the same information that was shared during that interview. Because, again, you can't capture everything. That's what's nice about having multiple interviewers. Okay. I did mention that the training is going to be very important. The remainder of our session is going to be really in the context of training the interviewers. So for those of you who might be in a position where you're developing a structured interview and then you're going to have to get people up to speed to serve as interviewers, we do recommend that you can use the remainder of the slides to conduct your own training at your agency. And then just kind of last step is to document the process. Anytime you're developing an assessment method, you're going to want to document the process. You're going to want to document who helped, who your subject matter experts were, how you came up with the interview materials, what references you used, and then that you have the job analysis. All this just goes into meeting the requirements of developing an assessment method. So you'll want to make sure you've got that documentation. So at this point, I've kind of walked you through developing the interview itself. Before I turn things over to Julie, I just want to see if there's any questions in the audience. Yes? Well, for a structured interview, yeah. The question was, when do you use a structured interview? When do you don't use it? The thing with the structured interview is that it's time, and it can be time and resource intensive. So it's maybe not something you'd want to use as a first hurdle or as a first part of the assessment process. You may want to use it a little bit later on. That's just the main consideration, is just thinking about the amount of resources that you'll have to bring to bear to do the structured interviews and making sure that you can manage the applicants that you're going to be getting. So if you're going to be getting way too many applicants to really feasibly do a structured interview, then I wouldn't recommend doing it as the first thing. think about using it later on in the process. Yes? Yes, that's a good point. The structured interview questions, it is the assessment. It is a test. It's what the applicants are going to be, all of the applicants will be responding to. So it's important to, when you're training the interviewers, to talk about maintaining the security of the materials. It's a live test. It's being used. So you want to, one, train your interviewers that they need to maintain the materials in a secure place and not share the information. But you also, when you're developing your interview materials, you want to instruct the candidates that they too should not be sharing this information with others, that it is part of the assessment process. So it's very important, as with any assessment method, to make sure that you're putting the protocols in place to keep everything secure. So, any other? Yes? Well, it's ideal. The question was, is it not appropriate to use these for technical positions? And the structured interview is ideal for competencies that are more what we call high touch or soft skills, but it certainly can be used for technical competencies or technical positions. It's just a matter of figuring out what are the most important competencies that you want to assess, and if indeed those are the ones that are most important, it's certainly okay to use it for those competencies. Any other questions? No? Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn things over to Julie, and she's going to talk about the conducting the structured interview. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Julie Osowski, and I'm a personnel research psychologist here at OPM. As Tara alluded to, the remainder of today's presentation is going to go over a process for conducting and evaluating structured interviews. This can serve as training material. I will begin with a brief overview of the interviewer's role. Then I will discuss one procedure we have found to be effective for conducting and evaluating structured interviews. I will close with several general tips for ensuring a sound interview process. Please keep in mind, again, that the information I'm going over is geared towards interviewers. So, whether you're listening because you will be conducting interviews, or you're going to be conducting interview training, or because you're just interested, please turn on or put on your interview hats for now. The job relatedness and standardization of the structured interview content provide a critical foundation for interview effectiveness. However, they're just the beginning. The effectiveness of structured interviews also heavily depends on a good and standardized administration process. Therefore, you, the interviewers, have a critical role. First and foremost, you want to create a comfortable environment for candidates so that they will feel at home and relaxed, sharing detailed information about their job-related behaviors and intentions. Most candidates are at least somewhat anxious when they come for an interview. Your behaviors can definitely help reduce this anxiety. For example, just being nice, polite, and respectful will go a long way. Also remember that a host of information is going to be provided by the candidate in a short time frame. It is critical for you to be focused, to give the candidate your undivided attention, and to take good notes so that you can capture a holistic picture of the candidate and evaluate his or her responses most appropriately. Finally, leave any personal biases at the door. You are responsible for treating all candidates the same and for being objective throughout the entire interview process. The way that you act is also important because you represent the job and/or the agency. And while you're going to be interviewing candidates, they're going to be evaluating you. They're going to form impressions about the job and about the agency and their desire to work there from your professionalism, interpersonal skills, and competence as an interviewer. So be prepared and act professional. Remember to make sure that you have all relevant materials prior to every interview. Dress appropriately. Know how to pronounce the candidate's name and use it frequently. Make frequent eye contact and use an encouraging tone of voice. And most importantly, make sure that you monitor your body language and only use appropriate body language. For example, don't frown or raise your eyebrows when candidates respond. Don't slouch, doodle, or look disinterested. There are several logistical and administrative duties that need to be completed prior to interviewing. We have found it helpful to designate one individual to be the chairperson and to ask him or her to be responsible for these behind-the-scenes duties. Examples of logistical functions include verifying that the interview length and setting are appropriate. We'll get into more details about these shortly. Examples of administrative functions completed by the chairperson include verifying that all interviewers have been trained, they know the candidate interview schedule, and they have all necessary materials, including the interview guide, the competencies, their definitions, the questions, the rating scales, and all rating forms. It should be verified by the chairperson or another individual that each interview has been scheduled for the same length of time and that this length of time is appropriate. The length of time should allow for introductions and interview instructions, responses to every question, an opportunity for the candidate to ask information about the job or about the agency, and the rating process. We have found in recent interviews that it takes approximately 10 minutes for introductions and instructions, about 10 minutes for a response to one question, about 10 minutes for an informal discussion about the job, and 15 to 30 minutes for the evaluation process. Naturally, the length of your interview is going to vary depending on how many questions you ask. Prior to the interview, the chairperson or another individual should also verify that the interview setting is private and quiet and accessible to candidates with disabilities. This is consistent with the goal of trying to make candidates feel as relaxed and comfortable as possible and welcomed. For example, you probably don't want to conduct an interview in a dimly lit, cold storage room or in a busy cafeteria where there's lots of noise, distractions, and eavesdroppers. It's also a good idea to make sure that there's a separate area for candidates to wait who haven't been interviewed. This will help reduce the likelihood that information about the interview will be shared. Once it has been verified that all administrative and logistical functions have been arranged, you're ready for the candidates. Upon arrival of the candidate, the chairperson typically greets him or her and brings him or her to the interview setting. The chairperson ensures correct pronunciation of the candidate's name and initiates introductions, again, with the goal of trying to break the ice and make the candidate feel welcomed and comfortable. The chairperson then explains the interview process to the candidate. This could be just in verbal form or verbal form with written form for the candidate to read along. This will help ease the candidate into the process because he or she will know what to expect. Following the instructions, it's a good idea to allow the candidate a couple of minutes to ask questions about the procedure, again, just to make sure that he or she is comfortable and ready to go. Then, the chairperson formally begins the interview. Once the interview has begun, the interviewers take turns asking their questions one at a time and in order. While the candidate is responding to each question, any interviewer can ask a probe question. Earlier, my colleague Tara Ricci talked about probe questions, but just as a refresher, only use probe questions if they are allowed and make sure you stick to the approved probe question sheet. Try to limit your use of probes. Only use them when it's absolutely necessary to clarify a candidate's response or to get additional information. Also, make sure that your probe questions are neutral and aren't keying candidates towards right or wrong answers. Additionally, when candidates are responding, monitor your body language. Make sure that neither your facial expressions nor body language are conveying right or wrong answers. And remember, never challenge a candidate's response by word or expression. Can anyone share examples of non-neutral facial expressions that you would not want to use during an interview? Yes? One more time? Crossing your arms. Again, because crossing your arms makes you maybe look disinterested or even evaluative. Laughing. Laughing is definitely not something you want to do while a candidate is responding to a question. Rolling your eyes, again, should be avoided while candidates are responding to questions. It cannot be emphasized enough that interviewers should only ask the approved questions in the approved probes. Therefore, under no circumstances should an interviewer ever ask a question about the demographic characteristics of a candidate. There's a few examples on this slide. In addition to being unrelated to the job and disrupting the standardization of the interview process, questions about these characteristics are likely to make candidates feel uncomfortable, unfairly judged, and may even invite legal challenge. Does anyone have any examples of questions that they have been asked or that they know that they shouldn't ask during a structured interview? Okay. While candidates are responding to the questions, interviewers need to maintain focus on the details of the responses and take good notes. Remember, a lot of information is going to be provided by the candidate in a short time frame, and once the candidate leaves the room, your notes are the only evidence of his or her responses. Therefore, taking good notes will help reduce the burden on you to remember specific details, and it will also help you in the evaluation process. When taking your notes, keep in mind that in the event of an appeal, your notes can be reviewed. Therefore, be careful about what you write. Make sure you're always professional with your notes. This slide summarizes the do's and don'ts of note-taking. Notes should be summaries of the content and be detailed enough for you to accurately rate the candidate. When taking your notes, do not write evaluations of the responses. Just document them. Any evaluations at this time could be interpreted as premature or biasing judgments. For example, you would never write, "This is the best response I've heard yet. We better hire this guy." Also, do not write any perceptions of the candidate. For example, "Sounds like she is exaggerating," or "He sounds like he's full of himself." Just keep reminding yourself when you're note-taking. No evaluation, just documentation. Throughout the questioning process, the chairperson keeps track of time and also makes sure that the interview stays on topic. Candidates sometimes get excited about the information that they're sharing, and they go into way too much unnecessary detail, or they jump to topics that aren't relevant. The chairperson should be prepared to tactfully and politely interrupt the candidates and bring them back on track, or to encourage a candidate to wrap it up. Once all of the questions have been asked and the interviewers have had time to gather enough information, the chairperson formally ends the interview and all note-taking should stop. The information gathering portion is done. During this time, the candidate is given an opportunity to informally ask questions about the job, about the agency, etc. Keep in mind that interviewers do not take notes about these questions and do not evaluate the candidate based on these questions. During this time, candidates sometimes ask, "How did I do?" or related questions to try to get a sense of their performance. Keep in mind that neither the chairperson nor any of the interviewers should give the candidate an idea of how he or she performed. After the candidate has asked any questions, the chairperson explains the next steps in the process. For example, how long the candidate should expect to wait before hearing back, or if there are additional assessments in the process. The chairperson then thanks the candidate, reminds them to keep the details of the interview confidential, and dismisses the candidate. This concludes our section on conducting structured interviews. The next set of slides will provide you with information on evaluating structured interviews, so keep your interviewer hats on. As with the previous slides on conducting structured interviews, remember, this is just one method that we have found to be effective. After the candidate has left the interview setting, the focus shifts from information gathering to information evaluation. The approach we have used typically begins with each interviewer taking turn to read his or her notes aloud to the other interviewers. This gives everyone a chance to make sure that they have captured as much information as possible on the candidate and that they have a complete picture of his or her responses before evaluating them. Interviewers are not supposed to discuss their evaluations at this time. They are only exchanging information. After information has been exchanged, interviewers individually rate the candidate's responses. One way of doing this is for each question, first, read the competency and the definition and the question, followed by the example responses for each proficiency level. This will help you get a right mindset for evaluation. Then, read your notes and compare what you've written in your notes to the example responses. Then, choose the most effective rating. Once the interviewers have had time to make individual ratings, there may be an additional consensus rating process. This would have been decided prior to the start of the interview. If there will be a consensus process, interviewers transfer their individual ratings to the consensus rating form, and they examine whether or not consensus exists based upon previously established criteria. For example, they could examine whether or not all the ratings are within 1 point of one another for each question response, or whether or not all the ratings are identical for each question response. If consensus does exist, again, based upon the previously established criteria, then the interviewers sign and date the consensus form. However, if consensus doesn't exist, the interviewers engage in a consensus discussion. Excuse us for 1 second, we're trying to find the slide. During the consensus discussion, each interviewer provides their reasons for ratings using their notes. Panel members should listen intently to one another and should be non-judgmental when commenting. The consensus discussion is not about who is right and who is wrong, but about determining the rating that best reflects the candidate's response. Sometimes, interviewers want to barter with one another or trade off on changing their individual ratings. For example, I'll give in this time on interpersonal skills if you'll change your rating on teamwork. This is not the point of a consensus discussion. Panel members should continue discussing until they have legitimately reached consensus. Additionally, interviewers can be obstinate and engage in polarizing. This is where they refuse to budge their ratings for the interview responses. If this should occur, the interview coordinator should be notified to determine the next steps. After consensus has been reached, interviewers should sign and date all rating forms and initial changes to individual ratings. The chairperson collects these rating forms and any other sensitive materials, such as the questions and the rating scales, and the chairperson stores these materials in a secure place until giving them to the point of contact. Again, these are all test materials and you want to keep them secure. This concludes the section on evaluating structured interviews. The final set of slides provides a summary of tips to help you be effective interviewers. Remember, your objectivity and accuracy during the structured interview administration and evaluation are critical components of the structured interview. relying on first impressions. Do not make quick decisions about the qualifications of a candidate based on limited information. Reserve your judgment until the candidate has responded to all questions and you have received all information from them. Focusing on superficial factors. Do not allow any characteristics about the candidate's appearance to influence your perception of their responses or to distract you from objectively attending to their responses. Candidate order errors. Do not compare and contrast candidates with others who have previously been interviewed. For example, if you have just finished interviewing a candidate who has performed very well, do not allow this candidate's stellar performance to make you judge subsequent candidates more strictly. Evaluate each candidate's responses based against the competency rating scale only. Nonverbal behaviors. Candidates are likely to be at least somewhat nervous during the interview proceedings, and they may exhibit behaviors influence of this anxiety. For example, they may tap their foot, they may have a shaky voice, and pause a lot. They may even fidget. Try not to give these behaviors undue weight. While they may factor into your ratings on a competency like oral communication, they shouldn't factor into your ratings on non-related competencies. Rater bias. Do not allow any opinions or biases about personalities or people or any other non-performance related factors to influence your ratings. In a similar respect, don't give the benefit of the doubt to individuals who seem similar to you. For example, you found out they went to the same high school that you did, or they seem to have the same personality as you. Concentrate on the responses, not on the person. Halo effect. Do not allow positive or negative information or performance on one competency to influence your ratings on other competencies. Some individuals are great speakers, and everything they say tends to sound really good. Take this into consideration when rating them on relevant competencies like oral communication, but not on unrelated competencies. As another example, a candidate may get off to a rough start at the beginning of the interview. Do not let this initial weak performance influence your perception of their subsequent responses. Treat each question as a new opportunity for performance. Leniency. Do not give high ratings to all candidates. There is likely going to be candidates who could use further development in some areas. Allow your ratings to reflect these differences across competencies and across candidates. Strictness. Do not give low ratings to all candidates. There may be outstanding candidates whose demonstration of competencies warrants high ratings. Again, allow your ratings to reflect these individual differences. Central tendency. Avoid rating competencies at the center of the rating scale. So for example, if your rating scale is from 1 to 5, this would mean avoid giving only 3s. When hesitating over giving somebody a 5, remember, this doesn't mean perfect performance. It just means that the candidate demonstrated behaviors that are consistent with the highest proficiency level. When hesitating over a 1, remember, this doesn't mean that the candidate doesn't possess the competency. It just means that he or she did not represent much of it with his or her responses. Irrelevant information. Do not be influenced by any irrelevant information that the candidate might mention during the interview. For example, while responding to questions, candidates might provide personal information that's not relevant to the competencies being assessed. Try to ignore this information and not be influenced by it, and don't let it factor into your ratings. We already went over voting, trading, bartering, and polarizing in relation to the consensus process. Again, during the consensus process, the goal is to arrive at the most accurate rating of the candidate. So be flexible with your ratings and recognize that others may have captured information that you have missed. If I had to sum up the interview administration and evaluation process into one slide, this would be it. As interviewers, know the competencies being assessed and the questions, the rating scale and the example responses. Focus on the candidate's responses, not the candidate. Take detailed notes on the responses, not on the candidate. Compare the candidate's responses to the example responses for each proficiency level and objectively rate the candidate. In closing, remember that you are responsible for establishing a comfortable, fair, and standardized interview process and for giving every candidate an equal opportunity to succeed. Make candidates feel as comfortable as possible by being nice, respectful, and professional. Be attentive, focus on their responses, and take detailed notes. Do not give negative reactions or comments about their responses or be influenced or distracted by non-job-related factors. As mentioned by Tara Ricci, if you would like additional information on developing, administering, or evaluating structured interviews, you can refer to the guide that we've posted on our website. That's accessible through the very first link, Personnel Assessment and Selection Resource Center. The remaining links provide information on the development and use of assessments in general. Thank you for your interest in this presentation. At this time, we'd like to open up the floor for any additional questions.
Mine is more a comment. I just talked to Andrea, and we have a list of sources up here, but I also wanted to let individuals know about an additional resource. I work for the Competency Assessment Branch. My name is Danielle Novick Alfaro. Some of you may have participated in the session last week, and that was a session that I conducted. Our group, the Competency Assessment Branch, does structured interview training, and we also do development of structured interviews. We also do job analysis. So if you're interested in developing structured interview, that is something that our group, the Competency Assessment Branch, can help you with. We can do the job analysis piece, and we're also available to do detailed training based on the competencies that you select through that job analysis process. And the training actually uses the exact documents you would use as part of your training and part of your interview process. So that's something that we do. And you also can practice using all of your own materials and get psychologist input into the ratings that you've provided. So it's kind of taking this and just making it a bit more customized to the actual interview you would be conducting. So I just wanted to let everybody know that that is something that's available as well.
Thank you. Are there any additional comments or questions? Okay, well, thank you again for your interest.